Yesterday, while we were discussing whether or not water is an economic resource, I brought up the notion of water as a human right, and it occurred to me that I haven't actually done a segment on human rights before. So, here we go! I'm Rebecca Farnum. This is Ramblings with Rebecca, and what's up with human rights? On the 10th of December 1948, the newly formed United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was a declaration. It was basically a pretty statement with a happy little list of things that should be true, more or less. It didn't really have any teeth. Since then, though, several actual treaties have been ratified, and human rights have been codified in such a way that, insofar as international law has enforcement mechanisms and, teeth, as it were, human rights law does as well. The International Bill of Human Rights consists of that original Universal Declaration, along with the actual treaties, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And those two things, states actually assigned onto as treaties, and, it details rights a bit more than the Universal Declaration does and that kind of thing. So international law is still very limited in its scope and enforceability in that it relies on nation states voluntarily saying, yes, you can hold me accountable to these, and here are the mechanisms through which I'll allow you to have some kind of power over us. So limited, but human rights has definitely become a dominant discourse, and the idea of human rights and human rights violation can be used to gain a lot of attention and action around issues. So useful in that way. But what is a human right? They're rights that are accorded to you simply by virtue of you being a human. They are universal and egalitarian, if we're talking about universal human rights. So universal, they all over the world, regardless of where you are or who you are or which country you're in, etc. You get all of these universal human rights. And egalitarian, so no matter who you are and what class or status you do or do not hold, you have the same rights. So a universal human right cannot be different for different people on any grounds, right? It's simply by virtue of being people you have these rights. They may be natural or legal. Kind of the biggies, freedom to life, freedom from torture and slavery, freedom of speech, thought, religion, movement, the freedom to be a citizen of a country is in there, freedom to seek asylum, to vote, educational rights, language rights, healthcare, freedom to protest, own property, have a family, work, right to love. So there are rights to do things. I have the right to do X, Y, Z. There are freedoms and rights from slavery and from torture and that kind of thing. So some of them are like substantive. I have the right to get something, or I have the right to not have to have something, those kind of things. So a lot of classification mechanisms. Some of them are essentially free. They just, require, not allowing certain actions to happen. Others, like educational rights, for example, do come with basic costs. So there's, of course, a whole conversation about, if a human right costs something, where does responsibility for that cost land? Is it on the individual? But then if it's on the individual, can we really say they're universal rights if suddenly they're costing people something and, we live in an economic classist society? If it's the nation state, what happens when nation states don't do the investment or can't do the investment, etc., etc. So big ol' mess there. And then, of course, also always adding and looking at that list. So water as a human right was added formally in 2010. There's conversation around reproductive rights, rights around climate and the environment, that kind of thing. And so lots of tweaking and questions and debates, particularly around the realization of human rights. But also some other critiques. There's very male-centric language, so a lot of feminists are like, are women actually human in this thing when you're talking about he has this right all the time, to say nothing of transgender, etc. And then perhaps the biggest and most kind of fundamental one is the question of who was in the room when these rights were thought up. It's a very Western notion of right and individual and society because it was primarily Western nations in the UN in 1948. So some third world thinkers have kind of a major beef with what is universal about this universalist?